Hello, and welcome to Airheads, a not-so-serious look at the serious business of royal rumours, gossip and gowns. I'm Tom.
And I'm Maeve.
Bet you all thought I was the Queen there. I've been taking some tips from Olivia Colman.
Oh my god, watch out, Helen Mirren. You've got a competition for seasons 5 and 6 of The Crown.
Yeah, I'm giving myself a long run-up to the audition.
I'm sure all of you, like us, are so excited that The Crown is finally back on Netflix with season 3. This is the first of our recap episodes of the podcast. So we're going to do 3. This one, we're going to be looking at episodes 1 to 3. And in the next one, we'll do 4 to 6. And then in the third one, we'll do the final 4, episodes 7 to 10. So just to warn you, this is going to be a very spoilery discussion. So if you haven't watched the first 3 episodes of The Crown season 3, stop now, go and watch them, and we will be right here when you're finished.
Season 3, we get a whole new raft of actors reprising the roles that we've come to know and love over the course of the last 2 seasons.
What do you think of the likenesses? What do you think of the transition from the young to the middle-aged?
It's definitely like a bit of a shock, I think. But Olivia Colman really grows, I think, on you when you're watching. Like, at first, all I could really see was Olivia Colman. But I think certainly by episode 3, I was really seeing her as the Queen.
I think Olivia Colman is obviously a much more known quantity than Claire Foy was. Similarly, Helena Bonham Carter, more than Vanessa Kirby.
Oh, yeah. Well, I don't think Helena Bonham Carter has done as good a job as Olivia Colman of, like, disappearing into the character.
But I don't know if that's that important. I think I'm still really enjoying Helena Bonham Carter's performance. She's very camp. Yeah. She's very lively. She still brings that kind of humour that Vanessa Kirby did as Margaret in the earlier seasons. I have to say I'm loving Tobias Menzies as Philip.
Yeah.
Was a big fan of Matt Smith anyway. But I am just blown away. Like, he really nails his voice. I feel like he gets that kind of very low, sort of gravelly texture he has in his voice. And also, I think he's making him pretty likeable.
Yeah, I was going to say these 3 episodes really seem to kind of frame Philip as quite reasonable and quite likeable.
What I liked was that they're very knowing in how they address this transition of age and the new cast. So the first episode, Olding, it's called, starts in 1964, and we open with that scene that was in the teaser trailer that was so good, of the Queen surveying the new stamp, and on one stamp you have Claire Foy's Queen, and on the other stamp you've got Olivia Colman's Queen. And it's a very clever little nod to the change of cast.
We get the kind of first look in this scene of a kind of running technique of, like, obscuring people's faces, seeing a lot of people kind of out of focus or in reflections. Like, we get the Queen, we get Olivia Colman's face reflected in the glass with Claire Foy's, and it's kind of merging.
I think as it goes on, it seems less clever to me. So the director, Benjamin Caron, is obviously very into this idea of using the silhouette or the profile to emphasize that these aren't just royals, they're people too. So when you see a character's back or whatever, you're not thinking of them as, oh, that's the Queen or that's Philip or whatever. And I guess it's meant to hammer that point home, and they're really hammering it hard.
This first episode really focuses on the politics of the moment.
Yeah, it gets straight into it. It's almost quite abrupt, I think, because we see the Queen and Prince Philip having breakfast together. It's the day of the general election, and they're watching breakfast TV, which apparently wasn't a thing at this time. But anyway. And the Queen is angrily buttering her toast.
So loudly.
Like shades of Phantom Thread there. And Philip is very concerned about the chance of the Labour leader, Harold Wilson, being elected. He uses very strong words. He's saying, they'll want us out. His cabinet will be half full of rabid anti-monarchists. They'll want our heads on spikes.
What do you do when you're worried about insurgency? You go see Winston Churchill.
The one remaining actor from the previous seasons is John Lithgow. We get him on his deathbed, and we get a rather sort of slobbering scene between him and the Queen, right?
Oh, yeah. We get this incredible line, where would Great Britain be without her greatest Britain?
And also another allusion to this, scary new prime minister, where she's saying, I can't imagine what it would be like having a prime minister one and couldn't trust.
Now, I'm sure this was written a long time before, but in the UK we have had, Boris Johnson misleading the Queen into proroguing Parliament, which apparently made her absolutely furious. And we also had David Cameron revealing details in his memoir about conversations with the Queen. So
breaking her trust.
So it's so timely. How do they do it?
And we see the Queen giving Churchill a little kiss.
Yeah, that was too much for me.
And so we bid farewell to John Lithgow. Churchill is dead. And in his place, we've got the new Prime Minister, Harold Wilson. This scene of him first meeting the Queen is so similar to those of you who've seen Peter Morgan's film, The Queen, with Helen Mirren, for which she won the Oscar. It has such a similar scene where Tony Blair, the then Prime Minister and also Labour leader, meets the Queen and has this etiquette lesson where he's taught what he's meant to say, how he's supposed to pronounce ma'am like ham and all that stuff. It's very, very, very similar.
This is Peter Morgan opening up Microsoft Office and the paperclip says, it looks like you're trying to write an etiquette scene about how to meet the Queen for the first time.
I thought that scene was good though. I do enjoy it, and these 3 episodes focus a lot more on these political tete-a-tetes between the Queen and the PM, but we know that Peter Morgan is obsessed with that because as well as making the film The Queen, he also did a really successful play with Helen Mirren called The Audience, which was about all of her meetings with prime ministers throughout her reign. So we know that this is like a particular interest for him. And I'm glad that they got such a good actor to play Harold Wilson. I am really loving Jason Watkins in the role. What do you think?
I think he's phenomenal. Yeah, he has a real quality of vulnerability, but also like a quiet kind of competence. I don't know. I think he plays a very complex role very, very well. And I think he works very well with Olivia Colman in these scenes, which is very important. So there's a lot of them.
Yeah, what do you think about... I'm like a little bit curious about them starting immediately with this very political storyline rather than having more of a family-related storyline. We don't get Charles in these 3 episodes. We don't get Camilla. We don't get Princess Anne. We're still waiting for them, and instead we get this kind of clunky storyline about the KGB spy, the Queen's surveyor of paintings, Anthony Blunt.
The storyline in a nutshell is that they're all worried about Harold Wilson being a spy, and the surveyor of the Queen's paintings fans those flames and increases her worries, and then it turns out that he's the spy all along. But he's not allowed to be exposed because they think it would make the government look really incompetent that they had this spy in Buckingham Palace for years. So he's just allowed to continue doing his job. So it's not the storyline that you kind of think of when you think, oh, they're doing a new season of The Crown. It's going to have young Charles, young Anne, Camilla's going to be in it. I think everyone was kind of hoping or waiting for an explosive family drama rather than this Bridge of Spies pastiche.
I was not terribly keen on the scene at the exhibition where the Queen almost confronts Anthony Blunt about his betrayal of her. She gives this rather heavy-handed speech about duplicity in art, and there's a painting on the wall behind her, and she's talking about how she learned from Anthony Blunt that underneath the face in the portrait there is another face. And
then he contradicts her right in front of everybody in this room, so actually it's the same face, and they have this very awkward argument that I can't believe anybody would ever have in public or in private with the Queen.
The one moment I did like with Anthony Blunt was the first time we meet him when he's showing Philip and the Queen around some of the paintings, and Philip instructs him eyes left, like commanding him before he gives the Queen a little smooch.
A pretty big snog, I thought. Yeah, that was really good. I love seeing those kind of moments between Philip and the Queen, like, because the way it started with the buttering toast really loud, I was like, oh, are they still finding it very difficult? Is she still very annoyed with him? But it seemed like that was more to do with political tension rather than marital tension. We still are kind of reminded of Philip's past, but yeah, their relationship seems to have kind of settled a bit. And so where are we going to get our drama from now?
Well, we'll have to turn to another relationship that is very unsettled between Princess Margaret and Tony, Lord Snowdon. I loved the first shot we got, the introduction of Princess Margaret in bed with her eye mask on, still wearing all of her jewels. We see she gets a phone call and she immediately hangs up the phone. Straight away you've got this conflict because we learn that Tony has turned down a lunch invitation to a birthday party that Margaret is going to with her mother and with the Queen, and we can tell things aren't going very smoothly between the two of them. I really loved the scene where she goes to bang on his door in this incredible billowing printed caftan with a gorgeous diamond bracelet on, and she just looks so...
Margaret.
So Margaret, just sensational.
We get a sense that the drinking and the glamour and the staying in bed till late that was quite charming and fun in the previous seasons has kind of soured a little bit. We get this scene of her singing a very mournful, drunken song, not very well, to a room full of people who aren't looking at her. And Tony is looking through this sort of weird little peephole that he has behind a book, and he's like absolutely disgusted with the state of it. And you can see that maybe the kind of qualities that would have been very exciting about her previously, he's kind of totally over, and the sadness that's in their relationship is really starting to come out, I think, in that scene.
We do get a lot more about the Tony and Margaret marriage in the second episode, Margaretology. Before it gets into the Margaret and Tony stuff, though, it starts off with Margaret and Elizabeth when they were children. We get a flashback to 1943, and Elizabeth is being told for the first time of her expectations and responsibilities in the future should anything happen to her father. And she immediately is panicking. She tells Margaret, I don't think I can do it. And Margaret straight away is like, I could. I'd love it to be on every coin, every banknote, to be the most famous woman in the world, wearing a big crown and bossing everyone around. And she tells the Queen to tell this aide Margaret's going to do it. And the Queen seems very happy with this suggestion, but as we know, that's not possible. So in the present of this episode, it's 1965, and Margaret is going to America with Tony to launch his new book, his photography book, in New York. But before they go to New York, they are stopping in San Francisco and Los Angeles. And there's this like really weird scene where they're at the airport about to go on the plane, and the Queen shows up to meet them on the tarmac, which is so weird. And she has shown up specifically to thank them for flying this way commercially.
Yeah, and this like glamorous lifestyle really hits home when Margaret's like, oh, don't worry, they cleared out the first class cabin.
Yeah, just for them. You know, again, something very pertinent given the debates around commercial and private flights in the royal family. Yeah,
and the idea of successful or unsuccessful tours. This obviously isn't a working trip for Margaret. She's going on holiday, but you get all these articles saying that she's a vibrant, modern and engaging version of her sister, which, must be tough to read. And Olivia Colman certainly does a stellar job in this episode of looking really pissed off and jealous.
Yeah, like brimming with envy and fury. I liked this scene where they're on the airplane, that like really fabulous scene where Margaret is smoking with that cigarette holder, and she's wearing the fur coat. It's so glam. And Tony's reading her the good reviews that she's getting, and they talk about how Margaret and Elizabeth are like number 1 and number 2. And she says, who's number 1? And he replies, you, naturally. And he says it's a tragedy for a number 1 to be born a number 2. So again, it's the whole thing about there and spare rivalry. But when they get to America, Margaret is the toast of the town. People love her. They love her glamour. They love her lively personality. She's out at all the parties. There's a lot of social events. But when the reviews start to roll in, Tony seems to be a bit jealous. He feels overshadowed. Again, this is kind of echoing like what we saw in the earlier seasons with Philip and Elizabeth. Like these men who are quite uncomfortable with having a supporting role to a much more famous wife.
Yeah, there's a kind of tension because he seems jealous and he wants to be recognised for his photography and his book that he is so excited about. But also, he points out the sycophancy of all these people around Margaret, and it's not really a secret that people used to make fun of Margaret a lot. The same people that would desperately want to be in her presence as soon as she was gone would start telling stories.
Yeah, and it does give you an insight into the strange nature of their relationship with each other and how they would go from being in screaming arguments to being quite affectionate with each other. And we know that's going to get worse as the season progresses. But back in the UK, the Queen has been assigned to try and soften up the new president, Lyndon B. Johnson. And Harold Wilson has asked her specifically to roll out the red carpet for him. She advises her aides that whatever they do must exceed what they did for the Kennedys. He seems to have this sort of inferiority complex about JFK. And they need to build this bridge with him. He didn't attend Churchill's funeral. He is not responding to Harold Wilson.
Screw the Brits. I never liked them.
Yeah. And so the Queen invites him shooting at Balmoral, which his staff tell him is as good as it gets and even better than what JFK ever got, but he still turns it down. Instead, however, he does invite Margaret to the White House, given that she's already in the States, but she is not interested. She doesn't want to go.
So the Queen knows that they need to get a huge amount of money from the Americans, so...
to bail out the debt.
Yeah, so when the Prime Minister is talking about this invitation to the White House and says, it's a political engagement of the utmost delicacy, the Queen says, to which you want to send Princess Margaret. Which was so good. And when it's all decided that she has to do this, we get such a great moment of Olivia Colman angrily eating an egg.
Margaret doesn't want to go, and we get that very heightened phone call where the Queen tells her, I asked you as a sister, now I command you as your queen. Oh, you'd be fuming if that was your sister, wouldn't you?
Oh, yeah. You start to see how difficult all these relationships are because a request is never really a request from the Queen.
Yeah.
It's, if you say no, then she'll just come back with the order. But she does so well at this dinner. It is a total success, even if she didn't want to do it. They're both quite coarse and vulgar, and they definitely like shit-talking people and telling all these dirty, dirty limericks.
But when they're not telling the limericks, I mean, the initial bond they make is because Margaret feels like she can relate to him because he has this sort of inferiority complex about having been vice president to JFK, this hero, and she says to him that she understands because all her life she has lived as vice queen.
Which is fabulous play on words there.
Rather on the nose.
Yeah.
But because she does so well, she starts to get a taste for more of this soft diplomacy. And when she returns to the UK, she asks the Queen if she would be prepared to share a little more for both our sakes. And she says that she's suffering in the classic way of despair, in that she cannot see what her purpose is, and she finds it hard to navigate this rather undefined role.
And the Queen does seem to consider it. She does seem quite torn as to what to do about this. She asks Philip's advice, and Philip has this whole worldview of the Windsors and how they fit into everything. He says that we were not born equal, and that in the Windsor family there are two kinds of people. There's the incredibly dull as ditchwater ones, like his wife, and
My God.
the dangerous, dazzling ones, like Margaret. But he goes back and he says that Elizabeth is like her father. They're the safe pair of hands. They're the people that you want to steer you through a crisis. But that, her uncle, Edward, who abdicated, who's now the Duke of Windsor, and Margaret are much more free-spirited, headstrong, and I suppose have the capacity to cause harm as a result.
But he does make it up to the Queen by calling her a dazzling cabbage.
It's so romantic.
Pinnacle of romance.
He's a real charmer, is that?
But she seems rather pleased with that. I think of the 3 episodes we've seen so far, the strongest one, the real standout, is the 3rd episode,
Yeah.
Aberfan. And I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that I didn't know about Aberfan before and hadn't heard much about it.
So the episode opens with these mining families and their kids being assigned homework of learning all the words to All Things Bright and Beautiful, going home, practicing it with their parents. You get a lot of moments of fathers coming home from the mines to see their kids. You get mothers, helping them with their homework. And then it cuts to Elizabeth, who is writing her diary on her own in a dark and empty room in Buckingham Palace.
Straight after the credits then, it shows the disaster unfolding. So we see the soil has turned to quicksand after this very heavy rain. One of the tips filled with coal waste at the top of the mountain slides down and crashes into the school. It's a really heartbreaking scene. I thought it was very well done. Like, it's very shocking, but it's also the way they build up the emotion in it is very affecting, I think.
Yeah, I mean, especially if you didn't know anything about this disaster when you went into the episode, it comes as a real brutal shock.
And as we learn at the end of the episode, it killed 144 people, 116 children, most of whom were aged between 7 and 11. So sad. 5 teachers at the school, and then 23 residents living around the mountain and the school as well. And I was reading a BBC feature on it, and they were saying that it happened at 9 a.m. and if it had happened even 20 minutes earlier, that the school would have been empty, which just makes it all the more tragic.
Yeah.
But I found, like, as the episode goes on, it's very hard not to draw parallels with the Grenfell fire, especially when we see scenes like the representatives of the National Coal Board refusing to take responsibility and the residents talking about how avoidable this was. They're saying it was a disaster waiting to happen, but no one listened. According to that BBC report that I was reading, miners did complain about this tip, that they were worried about it being unstable, but that the board had brushed their complaints aside, and the report says that the threat was implicit. Make a fuss and the mine would close. That while many spoke out about the dangers, others who had misgivings held their tongue, recalling grim memories of long years of unemployment in the valleys. I don't know if it comes across all that clearly in the episode how preventable this tragedy could have been, but that's something that I think again recalls Grenfell.
Yeah.
I think part of it as well is about the royals learning lessons. So in this instance, we see the Queen finding out about it from one of her aides, and she signs off on a statement of condolences. But when he then asks if Harold Wilson can use one of the royal planes to fly there, or if the Queen herself was considering visiting, she looks totally dumbfounded. She's like, why would I go? The Crown visits hospitals, not the scenes of accidents.
Right away, get this assumption as well that this is just an accident, which I think is something which they do address slightly later. But
she doesn't even think that her presence might be comforting to people,
yeah,
or make a show of support to this village that has experienced such a huge tragedy. So she like obviously understands her role in a completely different way from how a lot of people in the British public do.
Yeah, she's very much a queen about the red boxes, about paperwork, essentially. She doesn't, at this point, really seem to see herself as any kind of emotional figurehead.
But people really do want the queen to go. Like, when we see Harold Wilson, like, basically pleading with her to go, that little exchange between them is so fascinating, I think. Because, again, it reminds me of the Queen, the Helen Mirren film, where after Diana died and Tony Blair is suggesting that she make some kind of show of emotion, and she says, you want me to put on a show? And again, here in The Crown, she's saying, are you suggesting I put on a show? And Harold Wilson is like, no, I'm talking about comforting people.
As much as we might see the Queen as a kind of alien, in this she really sees herself as so far apart from the rest of almost humanity. Certainly
and
the rest of
it
people.
makes it so strange as well that they decide to send Philip, like such a, you know, not exactly the warmest man you could think of to be comforting people, but he is very visibly moved when he sees the wreckage, and as well, especially when he hears the hymn at the funeral. That little discussion that he has with the Queen when he gets back, he still seems quite shaken, and she's like, did you weep? Did you weep? Did you weep? Then he's just like so impatient with her. He's like, I might have wept, yes. Are you going to say that's inappropriate? Like, quite stern with her.
Yeah. As much as we focus on the human aspect of the Queen's response in her conversations with family members, we also get a kind of broader political take. We get Harold Wilson's wife saying that he should put the blame on the Queen for this disaster, and saying that her behaviour is symptomatic of establishment neglect.
Yeah, and they go on to release a statement to the press saying that her absence is symptomatic of a lack of care for the whole working class, which is really damning, and she is pissed about it. This is what eventually spurs her on to go to Aberfan, and I loved that exchange with her aide on the plane where he is sort of tentatively warning her, like, you know, this is Wales, not England, and he's basically telling her to make some kind of display of emotion. And oh my god, this display, like, you can actually look up the picture and see the shots of her wiping her tears outside the home of one of the families. It just looks so staged, and in the show they represent that very well, I think. Like, later on she is having this conversation with Harold Wilson when she returns to the palace, and she says, I wiped a bone dry eye, and then she makes this kind of admission that she didn't cry and that she can't cry. She never cries. She didn't even cry at the birth of her children.
And it's quite a bold thing to put into this imaginary conversation.
Yeah, and then he really hits it hard again in the final scene where she has requested a copy of the funeral hymn, because after being guaranteed by Philip that it's going to make her cry, she wants to see what's going to happen. So do we, obviously. And I thought it was really good how when it starts to play, we see her from the back only, and you're kind of wondering, like, what's her reaction, and you think it's going to leave you guessing, but then we do get a close-up shot on Olivia Colman's face, and this was a beautiful piece of acting.
Yeah.
Like, oh my god, she's got that Emmy in the bag. And it also makes so much sense that they didn't make her wear the blue contacts, because it would have totally ruined the impact of a scene like this. But anyway, yes, eventually that single tear falls from her eye.
Yeah, very impressed with Olivia Colman. Very unimpressed with the decision to include that scene.
Yeah, it was pretty heavy-handed, I think. I felt like this episode made a really conscious choice to encourage us to forgive the Queen for these actions. You know, in the closing card, it tells us that her delayed response to the disaster was her biggest regret, and that she's returned to visit Aberfan more times than any other member of the royal family. So you know, some people have said that this season has been less flattering and less sympathetic, but I feel like this episode in particular was really, really trying to redeem the Queen for her actions in the aftermath of the disaster. Like, to even include that line about how it's her biggest regret is a choice.
Yeah, that could have been written by the palace. That sentence, I felt.
From what I've read about the Queen's delayed response, at the time it was really read as a very staunch, stubborn refusal to go. And I think it's interesting that in The Crown, in taking us behind closed doors, we see the Queen seem to have a lot more doubts about this decision. Her chin is sort of wobbling and she looks quite torn up about it, and she's not sure if she's doing the right thing, and that's really sympathetic towards her, I think. And then you have Harold Wilson giving her an easy go as well, when he's saying that it's all the better that she is so deficient in emotion. He tells her, your absence of emotion is a blessing. No one needs hysteria from a head of state.
And that she just needs to fake the crying, like he smokes a pipe in front of the cameras, because it makes him seem more like down to earth.
Yeah. I think we can see that she has learned from this lesson in her response to the Grenfell fire in 2017, because it was just 2 days after it happened that she visited the rest centre where she met with volunteers and survivors and people affected with Prince William. And I also thought it was kind of interesting that many of the news reports from this visit talked about how she looked teary-eyed and appeared close to tears, and had lots of very close-up pics right on her face to see her sort of glassy eyes. She's leave us wondering about that now.
Yeah, putting the eye drops in. We thought we'd wrap up these Crown episodes with a little recap of our high and low points, but we'll start with the lows so that we can end on a high.
Yeah.
What was your low point from these 3 episodes?
I feel like some of the writing was just too on the nose. I like Peter Morgan generally because I feel like he has quite a subtle touch, but there were moments where it just strayed away from that way too much. I think the worst example to me was Margaret's conversation with LBJ, where she talked about him being vice president and her being vice queen.
yeah, that was seemed very heavy-handed. Mine is that seeing the Queen's tear, Olivia Colman's single tear, which, as I said, very impressive.
It's sort of emblematic of the whole approach of the show, though, breaking down the enigma of the Queen. You know, you would like to have that mystery of not knowing, but the whole point of this show is to take you behind the closed doors and show you, there's no mystery here.
What about high points?
I think overall the costumes have been really good. Like, the Queen can look a little frumpy sometimes. She's sort of dressing like twice her age. But Margaret's shoes are the high point for me. Like, Margaret's costumes in general are really good, but the shoes are incredible. Like, very interesting choices. We saw some beaded stilettos at the airport. Some fuchsia Diamante Mary Janes were particularly good. I'm looking forward to more of those. What about you?
It's got to be the Queen furiously eating that egg. I thought that was so good. It was so funny.
Yeah.
And really perfect. Just in general, actually, in that episode too, Olivia Colman's pissed off face was really, really impressive.
Yeah, and it shows that she can do such subtle work just with her face.
Yeah. Without
having to put these very overt statements in her mouth, I'm deficient or whatever.
Yeah.
She could do that with her eyes.
Yeah. Yeah.
But we'll see how it goes as we go on.
Yeah.
We hope you'll come back and listen to the next one. I mean, they're all available now, so if you've binged it all, you can just go straight into the second part.
If you like this episode and the podcast in general, please rate and review us wherever you get your podcasts.
You can find us on Instagram and Twitter at AirheadsPod and on Facebook at Airheads.
And we shall see you possibly in a few minutes.
Happy watching!
Bye!